Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to talk for just a moment as colleagues, not as Republicans or Democrats, not as members of the majority or the minority, but colleagues who are blessed to serve in the United States House of Representatives, the People's House, with all the tradition, with all the history, with all the laws that have been passed, with all the lives that have been impacted. I want us to talk as colleagues, because our foundational document gave us, as the House, unique powers and responsibilities. We run every 2 years because they intended for us to be closest to the people. The President was given different duties and powers. The President was given the duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is what does that mean to you, that the laws be faithfully executed? If a bill becomes law and there is no question with respect to its constitutionality, does the chief executive have to enforce that law?
Have to enforce it?
Yes.
The president has a constitutional responsibility to enforce the laws. And the executive branch has the responsibility of enforcing the laws.
Right. So you agree with me that if a bill passes and is signed into law and there's no allegation of a lack of constitutionality, the chief executive has to enforce that law?
I mean, we're talking about a hypothetical situation here now, and given the hypothetical that you have espoused, I would think that there would obviously be a responsibility to enforce the law.
We know the president can veto a bill for any reason or no reason. We know the president can refuse to defend the constitutionality of a statute, even one that he signs into law. We know the president can issue pardons for violations of the very laws that we pass. And we know that the president has prosecutorial discretion as evidenced and used through his U.S. attorneys. Mr. Speaker, that is a lot of power. What are we to do when that amount of power is not enough? What are we to do when this president or any president decides to selectively enforce a portion of a law and ignore other portions of that law? What do we do, Mr. Speaker, regardless of motivation, when a president nullifies our vote by failing to faithfully execute the law? I want to ask you this. You issued a memo directing in certain circumstances that your AUSAs and USAs not inform the grand jury and therefore not inform the jury and therefore not inform the judge about drug amounts.
About drug
amounts in Title 21 cases.
I'm sorry, drug
amounts.
Drug amounts, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Right, it's a memo. In cases involving Title 21 mandatory minimum sentences based on drug type, prosecutors should decline to charge the quantity necessary to trigger mandatory minimum. General Holder, we already have a safety valve. Congress has already passed a law that if you meet these requirements, the mandatory minimum is not applicable. So why would you eschew what Congress has done and trump it with a memo? Well, I mean, I'm really honestly trying to understand how you can respect the law and disrespect a statute that Congress has already passed.
Well, ultimately, I'm trying to do is to push discretion in the hands of the men and women who serve as assistant U.S. attorneys to look at the defendant who is in front of them and make an appropriate determination based on the conduct of that person what an appropriate sentence is.
How do we explain waivers and exemptions and delays in a bill passed by Congress and affirmed by the United States Supreme Court? How do we explain away a refusal to enforce mandatory minimums that were passed by Congress and affirmed by the Supreme Court? And why pursue, Mr. Speaker, immigration reform if presidents can turn off the very provisions that we passed? You know, in the oath that brand new citizens take, it contains 6 different references to the law. If it's good enough for us to ask brand new citizens to affirm their devotion to the law, is it too much to ask that the president do the same? If a president, Professor Turley, what are the limits of prosecutorial discretion? And if the president can suspend immigration laws, marijuana laws, why not election laws?
Well, I think that in some of these areas, I can't imagine can be justified through prosecutorial discretion. It's not prosecutorial discretion to go into a law and say an entire category of people will no longer be subject to the law. That's a legislative decision. Prosecutorial discretion is a case-by-case decision that is made by the Department of Justice. When the Department of Justice starts to say, we're going to extend that to whole sections of laws, then they are engaging in a legislative act, not an act of prosecutorial discretion. Wherever the line is drawn, it's got to be drawn somewhere from here. It can't include categorical rejections of the application of the law to millions of people.
If a president can change some laws, can he change all laws? Can he change election laws? Can he change discrimination laws? Are there any laws under your theory that he actually has to enforce? What is our recourse, Mr. Speaker? What is our remedy? Some would argue the framers gave us the power of the purse and the power of impeachment, but Mr. Speaker, those are punishments, those are not remedies. What is the remedy if we want the executive to enforce our work?
But I would just tell you that I always thought prosecutorial discretion was an individual prosecutor determining whether she or he has enough facts to substantially result in a conviction on a case-by-case basis. If a president is ignoring entire categories of the law, whether it be immigration, marijuana, mandatory minimum, the ACA, what is the remedy for the legislative branch?
Well, first of all, the first part of that question is, as you may know, I do criminal defense work. I would never go to a prosecutor and say, I want your prosecutorial discretion to say that the entire class of which my client belongs cannot be subject to this law, because prosecutors would look at me and say, are you insane? I am not Congress. So I wouldn't even raise the question. Now, in terms of where we go from here, I'm not too sure, because the great concern I have for this body is that it's not only being circumvented, but it is also being denied the ability to enforce its inherent powers. Many of these questions are not close in my view. The president is outside the line. But it has to go in front of a court, and that court has to grant review. And that's where we have the most serious constitutional crisis I view in my lifetime. And that is, this body is becoming less and less relevant.
Mr. Speaker, we are not held in high public esteem right now. Maybe members of Congress would be respected more if we respected ourselves enough to require that when we pass something, it be treated as law. Maybe we would be more respected if we had a firmly rooted expectation that when we pass something as law, it be treated as law. Maybe we would be more respected if we put down party labels and a desire to keep or retain or acquire gavels and picked up the history, the tradition, and the honor of this, the people's house. Mr. Speaker, the House of Representatives does not exist to pass suggestions. We do not exist to pass ideas. We make law. And while you are free to stand and clap when any president comes into this hallowed chamber and promises to do it with or without you, I will never stand and clap when any president, no matter whether he's your party or mine, promises to make us a constitutional anomaly and an afterthought. We make law.
Nell Lindsay was a nurse at a local hospital. Her shift had ended and it was time to go home. She couldn't take her own car because her husband had disabled the car so it wouldn't work. This is the same husband who had broken her jaw on a family vacation. The same husband who had knocked out her teeth in an Applebee's parking lot while her children watched. The same husband who had called their oldest son a sexual orientation epithet and put beer in the baby bottle of their youngest child. So Nell Lindsay got a ride home from the hospital from work with a friend of hers. And as they were headed home, they saw an ominous sight, Madam Chairwoman. They saw the car of her estranged husband. Now, he had been ordered to stay away from her, Madam Chairwoman, but he didn't care. And there was a condition of bond to stay away from her, but he didn't care. And there was a court order, an order of protection to stay away from her, but he didn't care. And when Nell Lindsay and her friend saw that ominous sight of Marion Lindsay in a car, they did a very smart thing, Madam Chairwoman. They headed straight for the Inman Police Department. And they're jumping over railroad tracks, and they're running stop signs, and they're running red lights. And Nell gets out her cell phone, and she calls 911. And she says, "Please help. Please help." So they pull into the back parking lot of the Inman Police Department, and she still has the cell phone to her ear. And through the audio tape that we played at trial, Madam Chairwoman, you could hear Nell Lindsay saying, "Please help. Please help." And then you heard 4 gunshots. And when they took her body out of the back seat of that car, she still had the cell phone in her hand. The system failed Nell Lindsay, Madam Chairwoman. She did everything we tell battered and abused women to do. The courts couldn't save her. The prosecutors couldn't save her. Her husband's on death row, but that doesn't save her. But even in her death, Madam Chairwoman, she did something good, because she spawned changes in South Carolina in the way that we treat violence against women. And with the help of Violence Against Women grants, like the ones that are at jeopardy today, with the help of those grants, and a woman named Lynn Hawkins, who I must concede, Madam Chairwoman, does not share my political ideology in any way, shape, or form. But she put the political sloganeering and the bumper stickers behind. And she said, "Let's change the system in South Carolina," and we did it. And it wasn't in time to save Nell Lindsay, but it was in time to save a graveyard full of other women in our state. So I'm going to ask simply this, Madam Chairwoman. Can we stop the election year gimmicks? Can we stop these manufactured wars that pit one group of Americans against another group of Americans? I spent 16 years prosecuting men who raped, stabbed, strangled, shot, and killed women. I have a mother, a wife, a daughter, 3 sisters, and the images of countless women indelibly imprinted on my mind, because they were killed by men who claimed to care about them. This is not about politics to me, and I will not yield. I will not yield. If you want to make women safer, then change the way we draw juries, change the discovery rules, improve the rape shield statute. But stop focusing on November's election for just one afternoon, and wonder with me what good we can accomplish if we will stop the political games, and if we could pick up some humanity and embrace the fact that even in a political environment as dysfunctional as this one, we can find common ground when it comes to fighting for those who have no voice, who have nobody to stand up for them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Holder, Assistant Attorney General Ronald Weitz wrote a letter to a member of Congress February 2011, a letter which was demonstrably false. Your department withdrew that letter 10 months later. When did you learn that that letter was false?
Well, I would not characterize the letter as false. I'd say it contained inaccuracies.
Well, Mr. Attorney General, it contained material, demonstrably false statements. Agreed?
I would say that it was inaccurate.
What consequences can we expect because of false statements made to Congress?
Well, as I said, there is an Inspector General investigation that is underway. I'll look at the results of that investigation, but I'll also be looking to see what happened with regard to the creation of that letter, if there's any more information that I can glean on my own before making determinations as to how people will be held accountable for the mistakes that they made.
Mr. Attorney General, it just seems to me that the policy is now going to be, let's get the least knowledgeable person that we can to write the letter. I found the exchange between you and Chairman Sensenbrenner to be interesting on mens rea. The defense is that Mr. Weich didn't know what he didn't know, so we're going to get the least knowledgeable person in the Department of Justice to write the letters to members of Congress. Is that what we can expect from now on?
No, what you could expect from this Department of Justice, as long as I'm the Attorney General, is that we will do our best to get you accurate information as quickly as we can.
Well, what I'm trying to get at, your defense of your friend Lanny Brewer, I guess at some level is admirable. I just don't understand it. It took me a minute to get you to admit that he knew that guns were being walked, and there are scores of emails where he admitted it. He assigned a prosecutor to Fast and Furious. This is someone who on his own website boasts of being one of the best 100 lawyers in America. He knew that guns were being walked. He assigned a prosecutor to Fast and Furious. He forwarded an email to his home computer of a draft of Mr. Weich's letter. And he's going to stick around, Mr. Attorney General?
Well, you're saying things here, see, but you're doing what I asked you to not do before, and that is conflating things. I said he knew about, and he admitted that he knew about gun walking when it came to Operation Wide Receiver.
Well, Mr. Holder, the letter is very specific. ATF makes every effort to interdict weapons that have been purchased illegally and prevent their transportation to Mexico. Is that true or false?
That is not accurate, but Mr. Brewer didn't, as he indicated, he said he did not have anything to do with the creation.
He forwarded this letter, a draft of it, to his home computer. Now, it does not take a long walk to get that he forwarded it to his home computer to read it.
I'm only going by what Mr. Brewer has testified to, which is that he did not think that he reviewed the letter, reviewed the drafts before they went out.
Who is Daniel Mudd?
He was the CEO of Fannie Mae during this period.
What was his total compensation?
I don't know off the top of my head, sir.
So you wouldn't disagree if it were $12 million?
That could be right.
How about Richard Siren?
He was the CEO of Freddie Mac.
During what time period?
I'm not sure, but it ended at the time of conservatorship.
Exactly, 2003 to 2008. Now, what was his total compensation for that time period?
Again, I'm sorry, sir, I don't know that.
Would you disagree with me if I told you it was more than $38 million?
I could believe that.
All right, so surely you can understand the frustration of taxpayers who are paying bonuses while the bus is driven through the gates of hell, right, and then you want us to pay bonuses while the people change the tires. Who was James Johnson?
James Johnson was the CEO of Fannie Mae prior to back in the 1990s.
And what was his total compensation during that time period?
It was substantial, sir. I don't know.
$100 million.
Right.
Now, he had a good working relationship with Congress, right?
Yes, he did.
Okay. Now, Franklin Raines, what was his total compensation?
I don't know, sir.
Would you disagree if it were more than $90 million? And he had a good working relationship with Congress. So sitting here simply saying that we need a better working relationship with Congress, one could argue that's what got us into this abyss.
I'm sorry, I don't recall saying having a better working relationship with Congress. I thought I said...
I've heard you mention the word Congress a half dozen times. And Mr. Chairman, if I could have 30 more seconds, the graveyard is full of people who are waiting on federal judgeships that never came. And I've heard the argument time and time again that we have to raise compensation levels for federal judges so we can attract the right kind of people. And yet every time there's an opening, there are 100 folks that are dying for it. They'll take a tremendous cut in pay. Now, I find it bitterly ironic that the total compensation for the United States Supreme Court justices is less than either of these two men made. So here we are again, Mr. Speaker, less than 6 months removed from last summer's so-called debt crisis, on the verge of committing another act of generational embezzlement, we are on the verge of assigning another $1 trillion of debt to our progeny because we can't muster the courage to make hard decisions. We're on the verge of $16 trillion in debt, Mr. Speaker, because we can't bring ourselves to say no. We're on the verge of $16 trillion in debt, Mr. Speaker, because we refuse to have a serious conversation about the role of government juxtaposed with the role of the individual. And in times like this, when leadership and moral courage, as my friend from South Carolina, Mick Mulvaney, so eloquently put it, when moral courage and leadership are needed, we get slogans more befitting of a student body president race than a campaign to be the leader of the free world. This administration says it wants a balanced approach, but a balanced approach apparently doesn't include a balanced budget. This administration says it wants a grand bargain, a big transformative deal, but the details of such a deal would fit nicely on the backside of a postage stamp. And my personal favorite, Mr. Speaker, this administration wants the, quote, rich to pay their fair share. I've heard that phrase several times this morning. What I have not heard, Mr. Speaker, because they never seem to get around to defining who the rich are, and they never seem to get around to defining the word fair, which may be the most subjective word in the English language. So I would ask, is it fair? Is 34% not enough? You want a half? You want 2/3?
Gentleman yield for an answer?
When will your president define who the rich are?
Will the gentleman yield for an answer?
And what's fair?
I'll be happy to answer the gentleman if the gentleman will yield. Will the gentleman yield?
The gentleman from South Carolina controls the time.
I didn't hear the answer. Will the gentleman yield?
The gentleman from Colorado will suspend. The gentleman from South Carolina may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope the generations that come after us will have the courage the generations that came before us had, for we have been profiles in timidity and greed.
I think that the American people should know that the members of Congress are underpaid. A lot of members can't even afford to live decently when they have their job in Washington.
So what is your thought about a pay raise for Congress? And this will probably make a lot of friends on either side of the aisle, I'm sure, with your answer, whatever it may be.
You know, Greta, I know a lot of people in the world that are underpaid. In fact, I live with one who's a school teacher. But members of Congress are incredibly blessed and fortunate to have the jobs that we have. Nobody makes us run. Every 2 years, we offer for public office, and if you don't want to do it, then don't run. But the notion that you can make $174,000 in this country and be underpaid is laughable. We are better off than 99.9% of the people that we claim to work for, and I would be embarrassed to say that given our job performance and our salary, that we are anything other than grossly overcompensated. Public service means you give something up. You get compensation in other ways. You get the benefit of working in the Capitol, of being part of history, of being able to vote for your fellow citizens, all of which is priceless. So even if we were doing a great job, which no one believes, including our families and staffs, believe we are, we still don't deserve a raise. Because there are equally important jobs like law enforcement and firefighters and education and anyone who takes care of children who make far less. My wife makes a fifth what I make. My sheriff makes less than half of what I make. And they do a great job. So $174,000 is a lot of money, Greta, whether you're doing a great job or not so great a job. And look, there are members of Congress that I think earn their salary. I think, you know, Jason Chaffetz, I'm a huge fan of his, Jimmy Jordan, Paul Ryan. There are lots of people that are in politics for exactly the right reason, but every one of them knows that you're going to give something up. If you think you can make more money in the private sector, then don't run for office. If you think you can make more money practicing law, then practice law. But don't run for office and then complain about the salary, because you know what it is when you file. And I'll say this to the witnesses. I prepared a list of questions for all three of you. But during the ranking member's opening statements, I shared with him on the floor, my mind went away from the questions and I went back to South Carolina. In the very same month, the very same year that the IRS was conferencing in Anaheim, we were furloughing law enforcement officers. We were furloughing teachers. Prosecutors in my own office were furloughed. Secretaries in my own office were furloughed. Those are secretaries who struggle to make ends meet under the best of circumstances. And here we're asking them to go 2 weeks without pay, and we canceled all out-of-town training. We brought our own food to our Thanksgiving and Christmas office socials. We started an anonymous fund to help our fellow employees who were struggling to make ends meet. And one night, one of my secretaries came in after hours and asked if she could borrow the money to buy her child a birthday present. And she kept apologizing for having to do it. She kept saying, "I'll pay you back. I'll pay you back." And at exactly the same time, that young government employee, single mom, was borrowing money for a child's birthday present, other government employees were staying in $3,500 a night rooms. Other government employees were spending more money on promotional materials than that young woman makes in a year. And other government employees were spending more money on audience participation tools than that young woman makes in a year. So, Mr. Inspector General, I appreciate the work that you've done, but with all due respect, this is not a training issue. This cannot be solved with another webinar. This can't be solved with just one more recommendation. If we can just get that recommendation implemented, we're just one recommendation away from people acting responsibly. Mr. Inspector General, we can adopt all the recommendations you can possibly conceive of. I'll just tell you, it strikes me, and maybe it's just me, but it strikes me as a cultural, systemic, character, moral issue. The IRS has been in existence, depending on how you want to count, either since 1862 or 1918. But in either event, they've had 100 years to figure out that while your fellow Americans are losing their jobs and their health insurance and their homes, you do not spend $4 million at a conference for which there is no accountability. You do not hire people to make meaningless speeches or artists to paint paintings of Bono. When your fellow citizens, the ones who pay your salary, are struggling, that is a character issue. Training cannot fix that. They sent more than 25 employees on a scouting trip to see whether or not the hotel was okay. That's not going to be fixed with training, Mr. Inspector General. When you got law enforcement officers being furloughed and you've had 100 years to figure out how to act appropriately, you don't need an IG report to tell you that spending $27,000 for someone to talk about how random combinations of ideas can drive radical innovations, there's not a webinar in the world that's going to fix that. So, Mr. Inspector General, in reality, it just strikes me that we just need one single recommendation. Start over. This entity has not only targeted citizens that it was supposed to serve, it's allowed itself to be used as a political tool. Not only does it have access to our financial information, it will soon have access to our health information. Those are details that we don't share with people that we do trust. And we're going to be asked to share it with people who are so disconnected as to spend this amount of money while our fellow citizens are struggling mightily in the fall of 2010. I don't think training is going to fix it. I think replacement might.
Utah. Mr. Chairman, you have an absolute right to remain silent. No inference or suggestion of guilt may be inferred from your invocation of that right to remain silent. However, if you do testify or take the stand, you will be treated like any other witness and subject to cross-examination. Mr. Chairman, the reason that that phrase is running through my mind is because I heard it for 16 years. It's being repeated in courtrooms all across this country today, but not for powerful people that work for government, just for everyday folks. Just for everyday witnesses or everyday defendants of petty crimes, not charged with violation of constitutional rights, maybe just petty larceny. But they're being told you have a right to remain silent. However, if you testify or take the stand, you will be treated like every other witness. Mr. Chairman, I counted 17 separate factual assertions by Ms. Lerner, not those 3 little sentences that my colleagues like to cite, 17 separate factual assertions. That is a lot of talking for somebody who wants to remain silent. That's a lot of talking. If you honestly believe that you can make 17 separate factual assertions and still invoke your right to remain silent, then please tell me what waiver is. Please tell me what constitutes waiver if saying 17 separate factual things does not. Mr. Chairman, she testified, I have done nothing wrong, I've broken no laws, I've broken no IRS rules or regulations. That's her testimony. What I'm saying is we should have the right to cross-examine her on that testimony. Because I'd like to ask her, when you said we need a plan, who is we, and what plan are you referring to? When she said we need to be careful that it's not perceived as political, who is we, and what are you concerned about the perception of politics for? What are you fearful of, Ms. Lerner? She said, I think we really need to do a project. Again, Ms. Lerner, who is we, and what project are you referring to? That is a legitimate question. And every brother and sister at the bar on the other side of the aisle would ask that question on cross-examination if given the opportunity. Can you imagine, Mr. Chairman, can you imagine a fact pattern where somebody takes the stand and says, I didn't rob the bank, but I'm not going to answer why my fingerprints are on the demand note, and I'm not going to tell you why I'm on the surveillance footage with the gun in my hand, and I'm not going to tell you why the dye pack blew up in my car. I'm just going to tell you I didn't rob the bank. That's not the way our system works. You have to answer the other side's questions. I think these questions are fair. The Tea Party's very dangerous. Dangerous to whom? Who, Ms. Lerner? Who thinks they're dangerous? You? The IRS? Dangerous in what way? We need a vehicle to get back to court. Who is we? Why do you want to get back to court? Could it, heaven forbid, be because you don't like Citizens United? Is that possibly the explanation? Mr. Chairman, she said Cincinnati should not have these cases, but then she turned around and said Cincinnati was to blame. That's an inconsistent statement. Every lawyer on that side of the aisle would ask her to explain that inconsistency. Everyone. So why can't we? If this isn't waiver, then can someone explain to me on the other side what fact pattern constitutes waiver? If you can make 17 separate factual assertions and authenticate a document and say, I have done nothing wrong, which is about as broad as any testimony can possibly get. I've done nothing wrong. I've broken no laws. I've broken no rules or regulations. I mean, honestly, what testimony could be broader than that? So necessarily, our cross-examination should be equally broad, and it would be in a courtroom. How often did you use your personal email, Ms. Lerner? That's a fair question. The Committee on Ways and Means just referred that issue to the Department of Justice. How many times did you use your personal email? When you mused about applying for a job with an organization connected with the president, were you kidding, Ms. Lerner? Or were you serious? Oh, we know you were contemplating retirement. Were you really seriously going to work? Mr. Chairman, I know my time is up. I'm just going to say this in conclusion. The same Constitution that allows her the right if she wants to sit there and say nothing.
I think
Allows these groups the right to petition their government for redress.
Judge,
Well, I want to make it easier for you. How long will it take you to produce Lois Lerner's emails that don't involve 6103 material from January of 2010?
well,
Could we have that by Friday?
absolutely not.
Why?
No way, because there's no way physically we can get
January of 2010. That's 1 month. No 6103 material. Just email.
1 month.
Just 1 month. When can we get that?
We have to go through each of those emails to make sure it has no 61.
Well, how long is that going to take? Can we have it by Friday?
I have no idea.
Just 1 month, Commissioner. January of 2010. No 6103. And let me tell you why I'm interested in it.
No, well, I'll tell you, today is Wednesday. I'd be happy to ask the people who do the work and get back to you.
All right, let's do January of 2010. And then let's get ambitious and do February of 2010. And then let's go March 2010. And I think you know why I'm doing 2010, Commissioner. When the president likes 5-4 Supreme Court decisions, he calls that settled law, like the ACA. When he doesn't like 5-4 Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United, he attacks it, which is what he did in January of 2010. And that's why the timeline is so important, Commissioner. The jury is never entitled to know the motive, but they always want to know the motive. You don't ever have to prove why somebody did something, but the jury always wants to know, why did this happen? And if you start in January 2010 with the president's State of the Union address, and then you move through Lois Lerner's emails that have nothing to do with 6103 material, you begin to see a motive develop.
Great. You're going to get 20,000 pages of documents this afternoon. Some of them may well be January 2010. But I will check with our people, because if you would like us to stop that production of Lois Lerner emails and go to January 2010, I will go and find out exactly how long.
What I want is this. I want the subpoena complied with. I want it complied with in a timely fashion. And you and I both know that if there's no 6103 material, whether or not you think we need something or we ought to have it, or that we're on a wild goose chase, frankly, I could care less what you think about that. Mr. Schulman, when you learned that conservative groups were being targeted by the IRS for discriminatory treatment, what did you do?
When I learned of the existence of a BOLO list, in that same conversation or right around that time, I also learned a couple things. One, that it was being stopped. So that.
All right, and who told you it was being stopped?
That's Steve Miller, my deputy.
All right, and did you investigate further? Can you give me the name of a single person who was involved in the original decision to target conservative groups for disparate treatment?
I'm not aware of those names.
Why can't you give me a name?
So at the same time that I learned and that it was being stopped, I was also told that the Inspector General was aware of it.
Mr. Schulman, is the Inspector General the only person who can investigate wrongdoing within the IRS?
My general practice.
Can you answer my question, and then you can explain? Is the Inspector General the only entity who can investigate wrongdoing?
Congress can investigate.
How about you? Can you do it?
The practice at the Internal Revenue Service that I inherited.
So if there's inappropriate conduct being done on your watch in the IRS, then that inappropriate conduct can last as long as the Inspector General's investigation lasts. Is that what you're telling me? That you're not going to step in and stop it?
No, what I'm telling you.
If there's someone wielding a knife in the parking lot, are you going to call the Inspector General? Are you going to wait until his or her investigation's over before you stop it?
When I was told about these allegations, I was also told that they were being stopped, and so that the inappropriate criteria were not being used anymore.
And despite the seriousness and potential criminality of that conduct, you didn't investigate it yourself at all?
So the procedures that I inherited and that my
Mr.
general
Schulman,
practice
this is going to go much quicker if you'll answer yes or no, and then you can explain. Did you do anything to verify that the practice, as insidious as it was was stopped?
The Inspector General was going to be looking into it, and that's what.
Is it that you can't say yes or no, or you're just choosing not to say yes or no? Can you answer the question, did you do anything personally to make sure that this insidious, discriminatory practice was stopped? Yes or no?
At the time that I learned about it, I also learned two things. The first was that it was being stopped, and the second was that the Inspector
And what did you do to verify that it was stopped?
The responsible deputy of the Internal Revenue Service told me it was being stopped. I had no reason to believe otherwise.
Did you investigate why conservative groups were being targeted?
Excuse me?
Did you investigate? So you can't give me a single name. You can't answer the who. Can you tell me the why? Why were conservative groups? Why was the culture such under your watch that an employee felt comfortable targeting conservative groups? Did you investigate that?
From my reading of the report, I can't tell if it was political motivation or if it was tone deaf, somebody trying to expedite a way to
You still don't know that this was political.
Excuse me?
You still don't know that this was political?
I defer to the Inspector General.
Well, I'll tell you this, Mr. Shulman. Your predecessor said that he wasn't sure if it was partisan, and that requires the listener to be as stupid as the speaker to utter a comment like that. He just testified that policy positions dictated this. What does that mean to you? If it's not partisan, what does that mean?
I'm not sure I heard that testimony.
Did you lift a finger to identify the facts?
Felt very comfortable. The facts, the Inspector General was going to run down the facts, and once he had it, it would be reported out.
Let the record reflect that's a no. Collectively, Mr. Chairman, we all understand why people want to come to this country, to escape persecution, to taste freedom and liberty, to know that hard work and education and a level playing field can combine forces to transform lives. Escaping conflict and hardship is one thing, Mr. Chairman. Picking a new home is another. And America is picked because we are a country that embraces justice. We reward fairness. We're a nation of laws. The poorest of the poor has the same standing in court as the richest of the rich. We believe in the even application of the law because law provides order, structure, predictability, and security. And what we cannot become is a nation where the law is enforced selectively or not at all. And what we cannot become, Mr. Chairman, is a country where the law is applied to some of the people some of the time. The president from time to time, Mr. Chairman, says that he wants a country where everyone plays by the same rules. With respect, they aren't called rules in this country. They're called laws. And each of us takes an oath to enforce them, including those with which we may disagree. Because when the law is ignored or applied in an uneven way, we begin to see the erosion of the very foundation upon which this republic was built. And make no mistake, Mr. Chairman, as surely as today one may benefit from the non-compliance or non-enforcement of a law, that same person will be clamoring to have the law enforced in another capacity. So we seek to harmonize two foundational precepts, Mr. Chairman. Number one is humanity, and number two is respect for the rule of law. And history is whispering, as you noted, Mr. Chairman, that we have traveled this road before. In 1986, we were told that immigration had been settled once and for all. We were told that in exchange for secure borders and employment verification, those who entered the country illegally would not suffer the full panoply of legal consequences. In the minds of many, Mr. Chairman, the country got amnesty, but is still waiting 25 years later on the border security and the employment verification. So here we are back again, asking our fellow citizens to trust us. And many, despite ourselves, Mr. Chairman, remain open to legislative expressions of humanity and grace. But they will be watching, skeptically, to see if we are serious about enforcing the rule of law. Are we serious about ending the insidious practice of human trafficking? Are we serious about punishing those who prey on folks with false promises and fraudulent documents? Are we serious about border security and employment verification? Are we serious about making this the last time we have this conversation? Or are we simply playing political games with people's lives and undercutting the respect for the rule of law, which ironically is the very reason they seek to come to this country in the first place? We shall see. I yield back. Thank you, Jimmy. We will not waver in our commitment to see that justice is done for this terrible act in Benghazi. And make no mistake, justice will be done. That was the President of the United States over a year ago. We're investigating exactly what happened, but my biggest priority now is bringing those folks to justice. That was the President of the United States over a year ago. No one has been arrested. No one has been prosecuted. No one has been brought to justice. We don't even have access to the witnesses. You and the media were good enough for my 16 years as a prosecutor not to tell me how to do my job. And so far in Congress, y'all have been good enough not to tell me how to do my job. I'm not telling you how to do your job. But I'm going to ask you some questions, and if you can't answer these questions, then I'll leave you to draw whatever conclusion you want to draw about whether or not the media has provided sufficient oversight. Can you tell me why Chris Stevens was in Benghazi the night that he was killed? Do you know? Does it bother you whether or not you know why Chris Stevens was in Benghazi? Do you know why we were the last flag flying in Benghazi after the British had left and the Red Cross had been bombed? Do you know why requests for additional security were denied? Do you know why an ambassador asking for more security days and weeks before he was murdered and those requests went unheeded? Do you know the answer to why those requests went unheeded? Do you know why no assets were deployed during the siege? And I've heard the explanation, which defies logic, frankly, that we couldn't have gotten there in time. But you know, they didn't know when it was going to end. So how can you possibly cite that as an excuse? Do you know whether the president called any of our allies and said, can you help? We have men under attack. Can you answer that? Do any of you know why Susan Rice was picked? The Secretary of State did not go. She says she doesn't like Sunday talk shows. That's the only media venue she does not like, if that's true. Why was Susan Rice on the 5 Sunday talk shows? Do you know the origin of this mythology that it was spawned as a spontaneous reaction to a video? Do you know where that started? Do you know how we got from no evidence of that to that being the official position of the administration? In conclusion, Congress is supposed to provide oversight. The voters are supposed to provide oversight. And you were supposed to provide oversight. That's why you have special liberties, and that's why you have special protections. I am not surprised that the President of the United States called this a phony scandal. I'm not surprised that Secretary Clinton asked, what difference does it make? I'm not even surprised that Jay Carney said Benghazi happened a long time ago. I'm just surprised at how many people bought it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Smith and Mr. Woods, I want to express on a personal level my gratitude and my sympathy to you for the loss of your sons, and to everyone that loved your sons and all the 4 victims of Benghazi. When you were testifying, I couldn't help but think of this dichotomy of death, that sometimes it walks slowly to the front door of your life, and it gives you plenty of time to get your affairs in order. You've had a good life. You have time to say goodbye to the people you love. You have time to offer a prayer for your soul. It just walks slowly and knocks gently on the front door. And then sometimes it kicks in the front door unexpectedly with no notice, and you don't even have time to offer a prayer. And the word closure is used all the time. In my experiences, it's only used by people who have never suffered the loss of a child, because there is no closure. I can't offer you closure. What I hope we can offer you is the truth, facts, justice, and let you do with that what you need to do as you walk down that road we call grief. So we can't give you closure. It's the facts, the truth. And the real jury, Mr. Woods, Ms. Smith, is the American people. They're the ones watching this trial unfold, and they will decide. They heard this morning a perspective that everything that can be investigated has been investigated. Everything. That's one perspective. The other perspective is you didn't even bother to interview some of the central key eyewitnesses. And the American people are going to have to decide whether or not they would ever tolerate an investigation where you don't call eyewitnesses and you don't call the people responsible for whatever the duty was. But I want to leave you with this. I want you to know this. From the upstate of South Carolina, I am asked about Benghazi more than any other issue. It has not been forgotten. I suspect you both live a long ways from the upstate of South Carolina. But just know, Republican, Democrat, Independent, don't know, don't care, from church to the grocery store to Costco, frankly to the golf course, I am asked about Benghazi and in effect about your sons more than any other issue. So the jury has not forgotten.
Good answer, please.
Yes, ma'am. I will work with Mr. Chaffetz, whom I agree with you on your characterization of, and the others. And frankly, there are folks on both sides who want to find out. And I appreciate the fact that Mr. Cummings has been here all day. I can't give you closure. I just want to give you the facts and the truth and justice and let you use it however you need to use it. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, for almost a year, there was an escalating pattern of violence directed towards the United States and other Western targets in Libya. Attacks on the consulate in Benghazi, attacks and assassination attempts on the British ambassador, attacks on the International Red Cross, attacks on courthouses, judges assassinated, culminating on September the 11th, and the murder of 4 Americans, including our ambassador to Libya. Before those 4 murders, Mr. Chairman, just a few weeks before that, our embassy in Libya said this to the Department of State: the security condition in Libya remains unpredictable, volatile, and violent. So, Mr. Chairman, despite what would appear to any reasonably objective observer as an escalating pattern of violence, including sophistication, coordination, and management, this administration blamed the murder of our ambassador and 3 others on a video. Don't take my word for it, Mr. Chairman. Let's look at what Ambassador Rice herself said. Our current assessment is that what happened in Benghazi was, quote, in fact, initially a spontaneous reaction. I don't know what the phrase in fact means in diplomatic legalese. I can tell you what it means in a courtroom, Mr. Chairman. It means it's a fact. And she went on national television and she said, not as this ambassador has said, that I'm not going to speculate.
But again, in the totality of looking at all the information that's been provided to this committee, we see the State Department trying to backtrack or cover themselves from not paying attention to warnings. The follow-on email was from David Adams. I'm with Toria, referring to Ms. Newland. The last bullet is especially, will read to members like we had been repeatedly warned. Followed on, I spoke with Tommy. We'll work with this in the morning and get comments back.
She said, in fact, This was a spontaneous reaction to what had just transpired hours before in Cairo, almost a copycat of the demonstrations against our facility in Cairo, which were prompted, of course, Mr. Chairman, by a video, is what she said. And then she proceeds to say the attack was spontaneous. I can think of few things, Mr. Chairman, more antithetical to spontaneity than a 12-month-long prologue of violence in Libya. And then she said she relied solely and squarely on the information the intelligence community provided. Mr. Chairman, I would like to have another hearing where we can ask Ambassador Rice under oath, who told you what when? You're going to blame the intelligence committee? You come before this committee and you tell us who told you it was a video. Who in the intelligence community said it? Who in the diplomatic community blamed this on a video? And then we move to Jay Carney, who's the spokesperson for the leader of the free world. This is what he said, Mr. Chairman. I'm saying based on information that our initial information that includes all information, we saw no evidence to back up claims by others that this was a pre-planned or premeditated attack. What we saw was evidence that it was sparked by the reaction to this video. And that is what we know thus far based on evidence, concrete evidence, close quote. Mr. Chairman, you know that in former life, I spent a little time in the courtroom. So when I hear the phrase concrete evidence, it means something to me. That's even stronger language than simply saying something is in fact. So 2 representatives of this administration gave demonstrably false statements, not just to us, but to our fellow citizens on national television. Now, is the explanation for those demonstrably false statements, as my colleague from Florida just asked, was it negligence? Was it just a reckless disregard for the truth? Or was it more nefarious than that? Mr. Chairman, the American people are reasonable. People understand investigations take time. People don't expect you to speculate until you have all the facts. What they will not forgive, Mr. Chairman, is being misled. We want our questions answered, and I want them answered by the people that went out before the American people and sought to mislead them by blaming this on a video when there is no evidence, concrete or otherwise, to support the assertions made by this administration. Mr. Chairman, I just had a conversation with Jason Chaffetz out back, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying this. He still gets emotional talking about what he saw in Libya. There were 4 brave Americans who died under circumstances that we can scarcely fathom. The terror, the fear, the anarchy of being killed in that fashion. They did what their country asked them to do. They stood post under dangerous circumstances even after requests for security were denied. They stood their post. The least we can do is stand this meager post that we've been assigned and demand that this administration speak the truth to the people it's supposed to serve. This was never about a video. It was never spontaneous. This is terror. And I want to know why we were lied to. And I yield back.
But I want to specifically address the family members that are here. There is no theory of the prosecution, Mr. Schiff, because there is no prosecution. There's a very big difference between a prosecution where you already have reached a conclusion and you're just trying to prove it to people. This is an investigation, which is why it's so sad that nowhere in that stack that you just put up there, where the emails of Secretary Clinton, the emails of the ambassador, 50,000 pages worth of documents, eyewitnesses, that's the real tragedy. To the family and the friends, when you're told that there have been 7 previous investigations in an ARB, you should immediately ask, why did you miss so many witnesses? Why did you miss so many documents? This is not a prosecution, Mr. Schiff. You and I are both familiar with them. I've reached no conclusions, and I would advise you to not reach any conclusions either until we reach the end. There are 20 more witnesses. So I'll agree not to reach any conclusions if you'll do the same. With that, Madam Secretary, regardless of where he ranked in the order of advisors, it is undisputed that a significant number of your emails were to or from a Sidney Blumenthal. Now, he did not work for the State Department. He didn't work for the U.S. government at all.
He wanted to work for the State Department, but the White House said no to him. Do you recall who specifically at the White House rejected Sidney Blumenthal?
No, I do not.
After he was turned down for a job at the State Department by the White House, he went to work where?
I think he had a number of consulting contracts with different entities.
Well, if he had a number of them, do you recall any of them?
I know that he did some work for my husband.
Well, he worked for the Clinton Foundation.
That's correct.
Okay. He worked for Media Matters.
I'm sure he did.
He worked for Correct the Record.
I'm sure he did.
When you were asked about Sidney Blumenthal, you said he was an old friend who sent you unsolicited emails, which you passed on in some instances because you wanted to hear from people outside what you called the bubble. We will ignore for a second whether or not Sidney Blumenthal is outside the bubble, but I do want to ask you about a couple of those other comments, because what you left out was that he was an old friend who knew absolutely nothing about Libya, was critical of President Obama and others that you work with, loved to send you political and image advice, had business interests in Libya, which he not only alerted you to, but solicited your help for. And you often forwarded his emails, but usually only after you redacted out any identifiers so nobody knew where the information was coming from. What does the word unsolicited mean to you?
It means that I did not ask him to send me the information that he sent me, and as I have previously stated, some of it I found interesting, some of it I did not, some of it I forwarded, some of it I did not. I did not know anything about any business interests. I thought that, just as I said previously, newspaper articles, journalists, of which he is one, a former journalist, had some interesting insights. And so we took them on board and evaluated them, and some were helpful and others were not.
We're going to get to all the points you just made, but I want to start with your public comment that these emails were unsolicited. You wrote to him, "Another keeper, thanks and please keep them coming. Greetings from Kabul and thanks for keeping this stuff coming. Any other info about it? Question mark. What are you hearing now? Question mark. Got it. We'll follow up tomorrow. Anything else to convey? Question mark." Now, that one is interesting because that was the very email where Mr. Blumenthal was asking you to intervene on behalf of a business deal that he was pursuing in Libya. What did you mean by what are you hearing now?
I have no idea, Congressman. They started out unsolicited, and as I said, some were of interest. I passed them on, and some were not. And so he continued to provide me information that was made available to him.
I don't want to parse words, and I don't want to be hyper-technical, because it's not a huge point, but it is an important point. You didn't say they started off unsolicited. You said they were. You said they were unsolicited.
Well, they were unsolicited, but obviously I did respond to some of them.
Well,
and I'm sure that encouraged him.
Anything else to convey? What are you hearing now? I'm going to Paris tomorrow night. We'll meet with TNC leaders, so this and additional info useful. Still don't have electricity or BlackBerry coverage post-Irene, so I've had to resort to my new iPad. Let me know if you received this. We'll talk about the new iPad in a little bit. Here's another one. This report is in part a response to your questions. That's an email from him to you. This report is in part a response to your questions. There'll be further information in the next day. If you're the one asking him for information, how does that square with the definition of unsolicited?
I said it began that way, Mr. Chairman, and I will add that both Chris Stevens and Gene Kretz found some of the information interesting, far more than I could, because they knew some of the characters who were being mentioned, and they were the ones, the kind of persons with the expertise that I asked to evaluate to see whether there was any useful information.
We're going to get to that in a second. Now, before you give Mr. Blumenthal too much credit, you agree he didn't write a single one of those cables or memos he sent you.
I'm sorry, what?
He didn't write a single one of those cables or memos.
I don't know who wrote them. He's the one who sent them to me.
Would you be surprised to know not a single one of those was from him?
I don't know where he got the information that he was sending to me.
Did you ask? You're sending me very specific, detailed intelligence. What is your source? That seems to me like a pretty good question.
I did learn later that he was talking to or sharing information from former American intelligence officials.
By the name of? Who wrote those cables?
I don't recall. I don't know, Mr. Chairman.
You had his information passed on to others, but at least on one occasion you asked Ms. Abedin, can you print without any identifiers? Why would you want his name removed?
Because I thought that it would be more important to just look at the substance and to make a determination as to whether or not there was anything to it.
Well, don't people have a right to know the source of the information so they can determine credibility?
But he wasn't, as you just said, the source of the information.
But you didn't know that, Madam Secretary, and that's what you just said.
No, Mr. Chairman. I said that I knew that he didn't have the sources to provide that information. I knew he was getting it from somewhere else. Whether he knew a lot of journalists, he knew others in Washington. It could have been a variety of people.
Well, if you're going to determine credibility, don't you want to know the source?
Well, it wasn't credibility so much as trying to follow the threads that were mentioned about individuals. And as I already stated, some of it was useful and some of it was not.
Well, did the president know that Mr. Blumenthal was advising you?
He wasn't advising me. And, you know,
Did he know that he was your most prolific emailer that we have found on the subjects of Libya and Benghazi?
That's because I didn't do most of my work
That's
about
fair.
Libya on
I'm
email.
not challenging that, Madam Secretary. I am not challenging that. All I'm telling you is the documents show he was your most prolific emailer on Libya and Benghazi. And my question to you is, did the president, the same White House that said you can't handle him, can't hire him, did he know that he was advising you?
He was not advising me, and I have no reason to have ever mentioned that or know that the president knew that.
All right, I want to draw your attention to an email about Libya from Mr. Blumenthal to you, dated April 2011. It will be Exhibit 67. And this is informative. Should we pass on, and in parentheticals, unidentified to the White House? If you were going to pass something on to the White House, why would you take off the identifiers?
Because it was important to evaluate the information, and from a lot of intelligence that I have certainly reviewed over the years, you often don't have the source of the intelligence. You look at the intelligence and you try to determine whether or not it is credible, whether it can be followed up on.
Well, I'm going to accept the fact that you and I come from different backgrounds, because I can tell you that an unsourced comment could never be uttered in any courtroom. You have
We're not talking about courtrooms, Mr. Chairman.
No,
we're talking about intelligence.
No, we're talking about credibility and the ability to assess who a source is and whether or not that source has ever been to Libya, knows anything about Libya, or has business interest in Libya, all of which would be important if you were going to determine the credibility, which I think is why you probably took his information off of what you sent to the White House. But here's another possible explanation that may give us a sense of why maybe the White House didn't want you to hire him in the first place. In one email, he wrote this about the President's Secretary of Defense. I infer Gates' problem is losing an internal debate. Tyler, and by the way, Tyler is Tyler Drumheller. That's who actually authored the cables that you got from Mr. Blumenthal. Tyler knows him well and says he's a mean, vicious little, I'm not going to say the word, but he did. This is an email from Blumenthal to you about the President's Secretary of Defense. And here's another Blumenthal email to you about President's National Security Advisor. Frankly, Tom Donilon's babbling rhetoric about narratives on a phone briefing of reporters on March the 10th has inspired derision among serious foreign policy analysts, both here and abroad. And here's another one from what you say is your old friend, Sidney Blumenthal. This is a quote from him. I would say Obama, and by the way, he left the president part out, I would say Obama appears to be intent on seizing defeat from the jaws of victory. He and his political cronies in the White House in Chicago are, to say the least, unenthusiastic about regime change in Libya. Obama's lukewarm and self-contradicting statements have produced what is, at least for the moment, operational paralysis. I think that may give us a better understanding of why the White House may have told you you cannot hire him. Blumenthal could not get hired by our government, didn't pass any background check at all, had no role with our government, had never been to Libya, had no expertise in Libya, was critical of the president and others that you worked with, shared polling data with you on the intervention in Libya, gave you political advice on how to take credit for Libya, all the while working for the Clinton Foundation and some pseudo-news entities. And, Madam Secretary, he had unfettered access to you. And he used that access, at least on one occasion, to ask you to intervene on behalf of a business venture. Do you recall that?
You know, Mr. Chairman, if you don't have any friends who say unkind things privately, I congratulate you. But from my perspective,
I'd like to think I'd correct them.
I don't know what this line of questioning does to help us get to the bottom of the deaths of 4 Americans.
I'll be happy to help you understand that, Madam Secretary.
But I want to reiterate what I said to Congresswoman Sanchez. These were originally unsolicited. You've just said that perhaps the main, if not the exclusive author, was a former intelligence agent for our country who rose to the highest levels of the CIA and who was given credit for being one of the very few who pointed out that the intelligence used by the Bush administration to go to war in Iraq was wrong. So I think that, you know, the sharing of information from an old friend that I did not take at face value, that I sent on to those who were experts, is something that you know, makes sense, but it was certainly not in any way the primary source of or the predominant understanding that we had of what was going on in Libya and what we needed to be doing.
Well, Madam Secretary, I'm out of time, and we'll pick this back up the next round, but I'll go ahead and let you know ahead of time why it's relevant. It's relevant because our ambassador was asked to read and respond to Sidney Blumenthal's drivel. It was sent to him to read and react to. In some instances, on the very same day he was asking for security. So I think it is eminently fair to ask why Sidney Blumenthal had unfettered access to you, Madam Secretary, with whatever he wanted to talk about.